Well, hello everyone. I make it 9:30, so I'm going to start. So good morning and welcome to today's CECAN webinar. I'm Alex Penn, Senior Research Fellow at CECAN, and I'm hosting you this morning. So for those of you who haven't joined us before, CECAN stands for the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. And we're a research centre which spans academia and practitioners and government collaborators. And we've been working to transform the practice of policy evaluation across the food, energy and water and environmental domains to make evaluation fit for a complex world. So we work on pioneering, testing and promoting innovative policy evaluation approaches with the UK government departments. So to find out more about what we do, please visit our website, cecan.ac.uk. And so today I'm really excited to introduce this webinar. So we're going to hear today about the really fantastic work that's been going on in Defra, the UK Government Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, over the last few years, which has really been innovative within the UK government in implementing systems theory in the heart and systems thinking in the heart of government. So we're delighted to have Dan McGonigle and Beth Wills presenting the webinar. Dan is Head of Systems Innovation and Futures in the Central Science Division, and Beth is a Senior Social Researcher in the Marine and Fisheries Directorate. They'll be telling us about the work that they've been doing, the journey they've gone through, and reflecting on their experience and learning from case studies. So enjoy. Over to you, Dan.
Great. Thanks very much, Alex, and good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you today. So yeah, as Alex said, Beth and I are going to talk about some of our experiences of applying systems thinking in Defra. It's not going to be a particularly technical presentation from a systems point of view, but what we want to do is to actually sort of talk about some of the experiences that we've had in terms of trying out different systems approaches and really setting out a little bit about how they've worked in a policy setting. So we're going to split our talk into well, two main parts really. I'm going to start off by setting the scene, talking a little bit about why we need systems approaches within policy making, and a little bit about the journey that we've had in setting up Defra's central systems research team, which is something which I've been leading since 2019. Beth's going to then go on and talk about some of the examples of work that she's been involved in on the marine side. Then we'll talk about some of the lessons learned and come together at the end to talk about sort of what the implications of all of this are for building systems capability across government overall. So just to start off with, I just want to say something about Defra's policy responsibilities and the areas which we develop and design policy to intervene in. So we have a broad range of environmental areas that we're responsible for. We're also responsible for areas like food production, for resources, waste and recycling, fisheries, marine policy, climate adaptation, and a range of other things. But if you look at many of the policy goals that we set there, a lot of them are interdependent. Many of the actions that you put in place for one goal have implications and impacts on other goals. So, for example, I've got a nice picture here of some agricultural fields. Whatever you do to drive food production will have knock-on effects on things like water quality, air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration, and a range of other social outcomes as well, which we need to be able to take into account. And I think it's worth saying that our organizational structure within Defra, but also sort of the way that the civil service is organized more broadly, we tend to break down problems into small parts so that they're manageable. So we have teams responsible for outcomes. Many of the outcomes on this slide We also have sometimes different teams responsible for the delivery mechanisms, for the grant schemes, for the regulations, and things like that. And so one of the challenges that we have is to actually sort of bring together people from across the department in a way which enables people to understand the interdependencies between their policy areas. The way I tend to frame the sort of policy areas that we work on, this sort of works, I put the slides together thinking about land use in particular, but it'd be interesting to hear from Beth actually whether it works equally well from a marine perspective, potentially. On the right-hand side here, you've got a set of different outcomes that you're aiming for. Some of those are environmental, some of them are more sort of socioeconomic in nature. As I mentioned previously, though, a lot of these interact with each other. But the complexity doesn't sort of finish there. You've got many individuals, many farm businesses, for example, in a land context, and other types of actors interacting and behaving in ways which impact those outcomes on the right-hand side. But their behavior and actions are influenced in turn by a whole range of external drivers, which can be cultural, can be market drivers, can be based on local environmental constraints, regulation, and sort of the things that government does, but also sort of macroeconomic drivers, which might not have anything to do with what's going on in this country. So, for example, we had a huge spike in fertilizer prices last year as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war, which then had knock-on consequences into our farming systems. So this is the kind of the picture that we're trying to pull together here. The Defra Central Systems Research Programme, we sit in the Central Science Division, which is a central team in Defra, which has a remit which cuts across Defra's areas of responsibility. The programme was set up in 2019, which was a time when we were thinking heavily about Brexit. We weren't quite thinking about COVID yet, but we were just about to start thinking about that. But Brexit was something which had impacts across Defra's remits. You know, we had a situation where I think 70% of our environmental regulation originated from Europe. Probably rather more of our agricultural policy came from Europe as well. So trying to change lots of things in different parts of the department at the same time, there's a recognised need for a team to come together to try and apply a bit more of to develop a bit more of a systemic understanding of what the potential unexpected interactions might be between these different areas. To look at trade-offs and synergies between policies and potential unintended consequences of actions in particular areas. So the team was quite an unusual one for Defra, in that we were a team which was a mixture of seconded academics and civil servants. We had a team of about 15 people. We had 6 seconded academics, which was the first time we'd really tried that at that sort of scale. And it was something which worked really, really nicely, a way of bringing in new ideas, new ways of thinking about how to do systems thinking in a policy context, which I think is fair to say at the outset, we didn't have a very strong idea of what a systems team in Defra needed to look like. And it's been a learning journey since then. And essentially what the team has done is looked at ways of bringing together people from across the department and outside as well, to understand the different goals that we have in different areas, and make those more visible. Looking at how different people view the purpose of the systems that we're working in. So if we think about the food system, for example, is the purpose to provide food security? Is it to provide economic gains for companies? Is it to provide health outcomes or environmental outcomes? Well, actually, it's about all of those things, but sometimes you just need to sort of bring people together to sort of understand where the interactions and the trade-offs are between those. We need to understand the interrelationships between various drivers, and that's the way, you know, I think a lot of this is about actually how you contextualize what's often quite a fragmented evidence base, into a coherent policy story. We need to look at different perspectives. Who should we be talking to? Which voices are missing in the policy debate around particular areas? How do we bring those voices in? How do we represent them? And challenging teams on the boundaries that they set when they're thinking about policy in a particular area. I think that there are three kind of broad applications. This is sort of three broad applications for systems thinking within a Defra context, within a government context, probably. The first is around framing policy discussions, and we've found that the systems approaches, and I'll talk a bit more in detail about some of the things we've tried out, have been really useful in terms of unpacking complex situations, helping to manage conflicting policy goals, and actually helping to identify new areas where we can intervene to achieve a particular policy goal as well. So framing policy discussions. Second area, which I think we can offer a bit of support, is around working at the science policy interface. And as I mentioned, we sit within the central science team. I come from a science background. I've worked as a government scientist for quite a few years now, and I think I'm very much coming at systems from that route. And the challenge I feel I've always had working in a government department is that actually the questions that we ask as policymakers are almost too big to be answered through conventional research approaches, at least through reductionist approaches. And a lot of the research that ends up getting commissioned is almost too narrow to be useful. And there's a sort of bridging role that needs to take place. And I think systems approaches can play a really important role in helping to bridge that and to develop a common understanding of what the challenges are between people who are policy experts and people who are experts in specific scientific or social science domains. And the third kind of key area I think is a really interesting one for government to explore, potentially a slightly trickier one for sort of politically, is about how we interact with stakeholders. And we've done a bit on this. We ran some citizens' assemblies on the food system, feeding into the National Food Strategy about 3 or 4 years ago, which were really successful and a great way of getting more voices and building a greater understanding of what the systems looks like from the perspective of different people. So I think it's a really good way of gathering knowledge and information for us from a policy perspective, but also a good way of taking stakeholders with us as well, and particularly when we're working in areas which are contentious and difficult. The sorts of steps. I said that this isn't going to be a technical presentation. I'm not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail, but I will just talk through some of the approaches that we've used through the work that my team's been involved in. And I think this is a very idealistic schematic here, which shows a nice sequential process from left to right. Which takes you from this sort of understanding the situation into actually sort of delving into policy options. In practice, it's been a bit messier than this actually, and what we've found is that a lot of these processes go on in parallel with each other. We sort of backtrack in the process and go back to our sort of earlier stages. And actually, this is actually kind of an iterative process, and I've tried to illustrate that with the kind of the circular arrow in the middle. But it's been a kind of a fairly creative process, I would have said. So we tend to start off with deliberative workshops, understanding what the key challenges are, what are the system boundaries we need to apply. What are the key outcomes that we're interested in as a department? We often do some sort of system mapping. We've used causal loop mapping a lot. We also have used material flow mapping quite a lot, particularly when working on things like waste and resources. And then actually, one thing which we find is actually quite often what we find are there are big evidence gaps that we uncover when we go through the mapping process. And so that tends to take us into something which is more sort of traditional way of working, I suppose, for us as government scientists, which is kind of literature reviews, going out and sort of pulling together expert elicitations and plugging evidence gaps, basically. Sort of iteratively building up this picture of how the system works. I'll say a little bit about system dynamics modeling. We haven't done a huge amount of this, but we have done it a bit in the land space. I think there's quite a bit of potential. I think particularly potential to help understand which variables have got the greatest impacts on the outcomes that we're interested in. Help us to sort of almost filter out some of the variables which don't have that much impact, so we can focus our policy interventions in the areas which have most impact, and also to explore policy scenarios. And we've developed a tool on land use, for example, which we use. It's an internal tool. It's not sort of publicly available, but we use it sort of to play around with looking at what the implications might be of different sort of things that we might do deliberately through policy, or things that might happen as a result of changes in the outside world. And finally, we've found that soft systems methodology has been really useful as well. Not necessarily a full soft systems approach, because I think we often find that we don't have time to do that within a policy setting. But drawing on elements of that and using it as a way of exploring transformation in systems and looking at areas where policy interventions can happen. So I want to go into to make it a bit more tangible. I've been talking in very generic terms so far. We've run systems projects on a whole range of different topics. One of the big areas we've been looking at, and a kind of nexus for us, I think, is around land use. And land use is something which affects food security. It affects all of those outcomes I showed on the first slide with earlier on. It's absolutely critical in terms of our pathway to meet net zero, which is a policy goal which is very prominent at the moment and has been for a couple of years, and also very important for meeting our wider goals on things like biodiversity, which are also goals which are very, very tricky to achieve. So we've through this work we've used causal loop mapping. I mentioned the system dynamics work already. We've used soft systems methodology, and we've actually run a lot of workshops with farmers, actually going out with them and exploring system change in a kind of deliberative, participatory way. Just to delve into a couple of the elements of that in a bit more detail, I don't expect you to be able to read the causal loop maps. I think my experience of causal loop mapping is that actually you kind of almost need to be involved in the process of developing the map for it to be really, really useful. But with just thinking about kind of broad areas of policy intervention, we tend to, the traditional way of thinking about policy intervention is in a few areas. Regulation, what we can pay farmers through agri-environment schemes, through advice and guidance, and looking at knowledge and skills. But delving into the sort of wider systemic interactions that take place, are actually a huge number of other areas where government could possibly intervene, and do intervene actually. And so I think this is about actually sort of being more explicit and deliberate and holistic in the way that we think about land use policy, and thinking, well, it's not just about regulation, incentives and advice. It's about a whole range of other sets of policies, all of which interact in ways which deliver the goals that we want. I won't go too much into the system dynamics modeling that we've done, but that's as I mentioned, it gives us the opportunity to dial up things like, we can turn up carbon price, for example, and see what the outcomes are, or sort of other elements of the system. One thing that we have tried doing, and there's a web link at the bottom of this page here, which you can take a look at if you're interested, is to actually try and make some of our systems maps a little bit more accessible. And we've been working with Department for Energy Security on this project in particular. So they've been leading this one, but we've been developing. This is a land use systems map, but there are systems maps now being developed for all the different sort of components of net zero, and so there's an energy system map, a transport system map, and such like. And we've developed this interactive web tool which allows you to click on variables, see what they're connected to. It exposes where there are feedback loops, for example. You can also play around with increasing or decreasing a variable and seeing how the changes transmit through the wider system. So that's been quite a nice way of actually helping to trying to find ways of getting people to interact with these tools a little bit more easily. And then soft systems, as I mentioned before, we've gone for a very condensed version of soft systems methodology. We use rich pictures as a way of getting people together, and in a fairly condensed set of workshops. We go through sort of looking at transformations, understanding what the transformations are, who the beneficiaries, the actors, what are the worldviews that are important, and looking at the sort of winners and the losers and the people who can either sort of enable change or block it. That's been very, very useful, particularly in terms of identifying key stakeholders, and also sort of developing conceptual models of hypothetical policy interventions, looking at how they might play out. So we've run that a little bit. One of the limitations that I think we've found with this sort of thing is sometimes there's a reticence to put too many of our cards on the table, I think. And that's something which I think is common across government, where particularly where we're working on areas where there are different stakeholder groups with conflicting interests. We don't want to necessarily have conversations in public around future transformation of systems. So actually, what we've found is that we've had to sort of find ways of working around that, bringing in sort of expert witnesses to represent the views of stakeholders we can't actually include in the conversations in the room. But actually running these within a purely policy context has been very, very useful itself. So just to sort of finish off my bit before handing over to Beth, I suppose, how's this all been useful? I think, we found that these sorts of systems mapping processes, and a lot of what we've been doing. I think when I started out in this setting up the systems team about 4 years ago, I was expecting us to be doing much more sort of quantitative stuff, working sort of on developing models and things like that. But actually, it's been much more participatory, much more of a social process, actually, of bringing people together, developing a shared understanding of problems, and also a super useful way of bringing together very rapidly fragmented knowledge. And I don't just mean stuff that's published in the academic literature, but also experiential knowledge from stakeholders as well. Really great for identifying evidence gaps, asking the right questions, spotting interdependencies, and those interdependencies quite often stretch out beyond Defra itself into other government departments. I mentioned DESNES, but I could have mentioned DLUC and a whole range of other government departments where we have interacting policy interests, and as a basis for exploring interventions and transformations. So I'm going to finish there, and I'm going to hand over to Beth, who's going to talk a little bit about her experiences of this work in the marine area.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to speak to how systems approaches have been used in marine and fisheries. And this has actually been led by our in-house social research team that I'm part of. So marine and fisheries, if you're not aware of us as a directorate, we do have a very wide remit. So this goes from international fisheries, fisheries negotiations, EU fisheries, domestic fisheries, and then we've got offshore wind, marine spatial prioritisation, marine protected areas, highly protected marine areas. So there's a lot going on across the Marine and Fisheries Directorate. And our stakeholder groups are also very wide ranging and diverse, and that's due to the many uses and the benefits that the marine environment provides for us as society. So if you can just go on to the next slide, please, Dan. Thank you. So following on from Dan's slide on the 3 applications of system thinking in government, I'm going to cover 3 examples where I've led causal mapping exercises to encourage participants to visualise, but also to interrogate the system in which they operate within. These examples cross both policy and evidence functions. And through this work, I can definitely say that we've able to spot the interconnections between these 2 areas. So due to the purposes of these maps being for learning for the actual policy teams or evidence teams themselves, and when we made these maps, we said that that was the purpose, so we won't be sharing them any further. I will be speaking about the maps, but I won't be sharing them during the presentation. So the first example of the system map that was created was part of the Offshore Wind Shared Outcome Fund evaluation last year. This map had actually 2 focal factors. One was offshore wind capacity in English waters, and the other condition of the marine environment. And this system mapping exercise actually followed the creation of theories of change, so both programme and project levels theories of change. And the aim of the mapping was to go a bit broader than these theories of change and to explore the broader landscape. So identifying areas where the programme or projects were or weren't having influence, but also to look at what other policy areas or other programmes were doing and what influence they were having across this dynamic high priority policy area, which is connected to net zero, but also biodiversity as well. So unsurprisingly, there were clear areas where Defra's role in offshore wind stood out, so like environmental data or monitoring, whereas there were areas where we didn't have much of a role, so like demand for energy and offshore wind design and construction. However, as Dan mentioned, causal maps are unfortunately a bit of a snapshot in time. And since the publication of the British Energy Security Strategy, now Defra leads on an area of work called offshore wind environmental standards, and that does include infrastructure design. So that area of the map is no longer accurate because the system has changed. So an insight into creating this map is that the policy teams themselves actually needed quite a bit of reassurance to engage with system mapping. There were concerns around what could be shared and what would be shared internally within the Defra family and also externally, and that readers might take the map as a policy commitment rather than a tool to provide learning for the evaluation. So this was actually mitigated by working closely with our contractors and our valuation team to present on the benefits and the purpose of system mapping. Within this policy area, one reflection is actually that theories of change have definitely landed a lot better and they're used a lot more than the system mapping outputs. So the second example is actually a more recent example from October this year, and that was a facilitation of a system mapping exercise with the Marine Management Organisation. So this system map was to help them to prioritise their evidence and analysis to achieve their strategic objectives and goals. So there was a group of about, I think it was about 14 or 16 in the end. We tried to cap it, but just more people kept coming in. So each of those came from a different team and they brought like a different view of the organisation. Myself and the lead from the MMO, we wanted to present systems approaches, and in this case, causal mapping. No, it's okay, the slides are good for now. So yeah, we wanted to present causal mapping as a means to help them to understand what's going on and to plan and prioritize. So we started with a rich picture exercise, and then we had quite in-depth discussion to enable us to pick the 20 most important factors. And then throughout the workshop day, I put in what I termed reflection sections for us to actually look at the emerging submaps and feedback loops, and to have some discussion about that. Since the end of that mapping, so just digitalize the map and sent that to the MMO, and they've used that to create task and finish groups, which they can take forward some of these priorities as actions. And the third mapping exercise, actually, it's not necessarily causal mapping. It's a bit of a, I guess, just a bit of a trial and error, but I'll just call it dependency mapping. But please don't pull me up on it if it's not. But it was basically wanted to use a type of mapping to consider a governance refresh within my division. So I wanted to, with the support of project leads, to map out the main policy areas in the division, but also the evidence projects that feed in information to those policy areas. And then did an exercise to rank the low, medium and strong connections between the policies to be able to identify any areas of duplication. So this was a very quick exercise, but it was useful because it allowed evidence colleagues to ensure joined up working and to think about areas where there could be more effective data sharing or evidence collation. To complement this exercise, I interviewed the team leads on their views of having embedded, hybrid and separate analytical support to support our colleagues in policy making. And all this information fed into the evidence refresh. We do continue to actually provide tailored support though across all these different 3 ways of working. Next slide, please. So on the topic of capabilities and capacity for system thinking in government, I'll touch on 2 ways that we've actually supported this in the Marine and Fisheries Social Science team. So the first was a social mapping, so using participatory system mapping to map the social and cultural dimensions of ocean sustainability. And this work was supported by the Defra Systems Research Group. So we did this work to refresh our own capabilities in using system thinking approaches, but also to get our thoughts on paper on the work that we do now and whether this is in fact the best work for us to be focusing on in the future. So a few findings were that we had really high connectivity areas and a lot of discussion around coastal communities and the impact of change on coastal communities. But this is not necessarily an area that Defra Marine and Fisheries lead on. So connected to coastal communities were factors such as identity, social fabric and social capital, and also links to positive mental health. So there are lots of interesting areas here, but actually to work on them and to make impact, we'll need to explore working across different government departments and what role Defra could kind of carve out for themselves in this space. Some also surprising themes that emerged were around waste pollution, and this was actually defined as from a terrestrial origin, so linking back to that land use map at the beginning, and also the influence of funding and money across the whole map. Particularly important in the marine environment when everything is super expensive to get data from. So the next steps for my team in this is to broaden this out to consider ocean sustainability, not just the social elements of it across the whole directorate, and to actually think about the arm's length bodies and the role of policy and evidence from within this. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just want to move on to the second way we're improving in-house capability. And we're trying to just have a bit of fun with it, really. So obviously, thinking of systems can be as we said, can be quite overwhelming and quite a new thing for some people. So what we were doing is just to try and find a way in within our directorate. So about 6 months ago now, myself and a colleague, Ed Heindosen, created the Ocean Sustainability System Book Club from within our directorate. So we set realistic amounts of reading, and we have open discussions every 2 weeks with our colleagues about what was in the books, but also just relate this to our experiences in marine and fisheries. So we started with the Art Systems Change WWF book, which was really great introduction. And then we had a colleague who's doing a systems apprenticeship at the University of Exeter, run 3 sessions using critical systems heuristic methodology to explore a governance issue. And we were happy to be guinea pigs to her piloting her interview technique on us. So getting a real sort of first-hand experience of using systems thinking and thinking about complex systems. So now we are nearly through. Hopefully by Christmas, we will be able to wrap up on Donella Meadows' book, which has actually fueled some really great conversations and started to make us as a team think about what we want to explore sort of next year. So we have attendance to this book club from both policy and evidence colleagues, and even though it's a bit of fun, it is a small step towards normalising systems thinking within marine and fisheries. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just like personal reflection from me. As we were saying, this is not necessarily a technical talk, but more of a kind of dicto in feelings kind of approach. So I've been in marine and fisheries for about 2.5 years now. And because of my background and having the time to actually understand systems thinking and learn it, I've found it easy to promote systems thinking from within, and see the benefits of it. However, for other people that I've spoken to, and for others within the civil service, it is more of a hard sell. So there are a few reasons for this, and just a couple to touch on now, but I'll go into some more further. Is time. They're not used to it, so it can be quite different from normal approaches, because of the way that some government departments are set up. There needs to be the support from senior staff. So if you don't have that support from senior staff, it can make sort of implementing new approaches quite challenging. And there's also an element of sort of risk management around it as well. So I think each directorate, for me, like one great thing that I would like to see happen is for each directorate to have like a systems steward. And I'm not copywriting that, that's just an idea. So someone internal who can introduce systems thinking, but actually like take the time with the different policies teams or different evidence teams or individuals to actually relate it to their day-to-day and find that connection for them. So this would be an additional resource, but again, it would just be a way that we could sort of accelerate some change from within Defra. Next slide, please. Okay, so here Dan and I have just pulled together some cross-cutting lessons from our different perspectives on where we've come in from systems thinking. So when we were discussing this, like Dan has much of more of an overarching view across Defra, and I will be much more sort of down at the next kind of nested level looking at marine fisheries. But just in discussion, we found that actually there's quite a lot from our work that came out as cross-cutting. So I've got 5 sort of key lessons learned to share with you today. So the first one is that systems approaches have been valuable to bring people together. So they've been shown to be extremely helpful in mobilising the many actors that are involved in policy scope, design and implementation. So some programmes such as the Offshore Wind Enabling Action Programme, which is that shared outcome fund programme, had those shared objectives that needed to be delivered across government departments. And so systems approaches using systems approaches actually supported the creation of a culture of collaboration between those two different departments. Rich pictures, for example, they can be construed as being too simplistic, but when people get going on them, they do notice that it offers them a gateway to actually invite and explore diverse viewpoints on a shared topic. Secondly, we both recognise the role and practical implications of politics on civil servants and how this can impact their use of system thinking. So there are several factors at play here. I'll just go through a few, but it's probably not all. So the ambitions and aims of policy can actually be quite immense in their scale, and there can be quite high expectations placed on system thinking to provide the answer. So colleagues that are working in an active policy space, so colleagues that are delivering a bill at pace, for example, can struggle to open up to see the whole system. There is political nervousness sometimes around what can be shared and what's policy commitment, what's learning. Like I spoke to in the offshore wind example, there's also a need to manage the expectations of external stakeholders. And one thing that we've shared between us is that one solution to this could be having internally and externally facing materials. Unsurprisingly, there are time pressures, and one way around that is by delivering individual time-bound activities. So sort of not needing too much time all at once, but thinking about how you can make the most value of snippets of people's times. To improve impact, you need to make the engagement and the process and the outputs sort of immediately useful to the people that are involved. So engage them at the beginning and try and understand what decisions they're having to make and how system thinking can actually help them. And as previously mentioned, and this seems to be a learning that most people come to, but there is real value in actually the process of doing these approaches are just as important, or if not more important, than the outputs. Thirdly, the audience is not the same. So evidence and policy teams and senior leaders do want different levels of detail. So do think about the purposes of the systems approach and the uses of the outputs. So evidence teams, analysts like myself, they might be intently interested and willing to nerd out on all the nitty-gritty details. However, others might go straight for the, well, so what? How does this help us deliver for our government commitment? Or I'm sure there are many people that sit in the middle also. So the fourth is mixing methods is an exciting space, and it is the space that those involved in systems approaches in Defra are sitting quite happily within. So an example from Dan's part of the presentation was use of participatory mapping to build quantitative models. And for myself, use of that dependency mapping approach, structured interviews and a division-wide survey to help support my division's leaders' evidence refresh. Lastly, so number 5 is well-facilitated system mapping workshops can enable insightful communication between the people that are tasked to deliver the change or to deliver against a set outcome. So having an open map, an open conversation can spark new ideas and actually help these teams to prioritise and narrow down on the actions that they are going to take after engaging these exercises. However, our world does not stand still, and the factors are changing all of the time. And so the systems approaches that we deploy in Defra really need to accept this and to help us to change and adapt to different emerging priorities as they occur, or ideally before they occur, and also to bring people along with us. So I'll just pass back to Dan to finish off now.
Great. Thanks, Beth. And this is our last slide, and I think we're pretty much on time anyway, so a good place to finish potentially. So I just wanted to say a little bit more about what we're doing to boost capacity and systems thinking across government. And I think, reflecting back over the last 4 years, we've had quite sort of consistent, actually, really senior level push towards developing systems thinking approaches across government. And that's been from people like our own permanent secretary, our former chief scientific advisor. We had the Council for Science and Technology publish a report 2 years ago, I think it was, on net zero, really setting out to the Prime Minister how this is a systems problem, it needs a set of systems approaches. So we've been building capability within Defra and across more broadly across government through a variety of different means. We've got a cross-Whitehall community of practice, which is actually led out of Department for Transport and Department for Energy Security. There's about 600 people involved in that, different levels of practitioners, I guess, covering 30 organisations. We've got a Defra systems community of practice, which my team set up, has been running for a couple of years now, with about 300 people involved in that from right across the department. And that's been a really great way of bringing in external speakers to come and talk to us, to help us develop our own learning about new approaches, or new for us approaches of quite often. We've set up our own training in-house. We've got a training module that we've developed for the Defra policy schools. This is training up policy professionals to give them a very brief introduction to systems thinking. We bring in external trainers sometimes as well to train up our own team, so that we're better skilled to then go off and try stuff out in the department. And as Beth mentioned as well, we also have quite a few people who are pushing through various systems apprenticeships as well. We've published materials on the web. We've got a primer on systems thinking in Defra, which you can take a look at. There's a gov.uk link there. There's a whole raft of other materials which have been developed sort of more broadly from Go Science, and looking across Whitehall there as well, case studies and toolkits. And then we've got the interactive systems mapping tool that I mentioned earlier as well. And we also are continuing to use secondments into government as a route into bringing systems thinking expertise into the department. And there's a link down there if anyone's interested in a secondment into Defra. We've got a call that opened I think last Thursday to bring in some academic secondees into the department to help us out across a whole range of different areas. So take a look at that if you're interested. Great. So we'll finish there. So I think I'll probably back over to Alex.
Yeah, so thanks both of you. That was great. Really interesting stuff. So we've got questions in the Q&A, and any of you watching can add questions. You can also, I think, upvote questions. So if you want to kind of support a question that's already there, please do so. So, okay, I'm going to start with some that have already been upvoted. So across Defra, how have you managed to raise awareness of systems thinking, and how have you managed the process of getting different teams or areas to commission the help of the systems team in applying systems thinking?
Shall I pick that up to begin with, and then Beth, if you want to come in as well. So I mean, this picks up on my last slide, I guess, in that we've got mechanisms that we've been using. I think the way that my team works is we kind of work in sort of 3 modes really. One mode is we run our own projects and we pick up stuff that nobody else in the department is looking at, and we try and run strategic projects to fill gaps. And then we go out and talk to people. We engage people in the process of that, and that's a way of actually engaging people in the process, helping people to sort of understand what systems approaches can bring. We also act as a sort of in-house consultancy, so we go off and help policy teams set up their own bits of systems research which they might want to run themselves. So there's a bit of an element of capacity building there as well. And then the third is the various things that I showed on that last slide in terms of methods of getting the message out there. And we do that both at the sort of grassroots level, I suppose, in terms of people who are interested in applying systems thinking through the community of practice, but also through the conversations we have with senior leaders across the department as well. And we've had our permanent secretary has been a great champion of systems thinking, as has our chief scientist over the last few years.
Great, thank you. So I think there's one for Beth now. So Tony DeVos has asked, you mentioned with policy change around offshore wind responsibilities, the system mapping became redundant. Are there plans to revisit this with the change systems dynamics to identify opportunities or threats as a result of the policy change?
Yeah, thank you. So as part of this evaluation is continuing. We are sort of reflecting on what worked and what didn't work with our policy colleagues in offshore wind. So I know that the systems map it's going on and changing, and unless we actually take the time to actually redo it and re-explore it. But one way that we are still thinking about including a systems approach is actually by using theories of change. So a theory of change, you can go slightly up from sort of a logic chain model and do it quite linear way. But in the way that Defra have actually developed their theory of change and their theory of change tool, even though it's not quite as open and includes quite as much context as a system map might be able to do, it still enables like myself and the evaluation team to explore what is happening and where the policy team actually want to go, but also under the assumptions where they believe some areas of other organizations' work are having an impact. So it's just something that we as a kind of supportive team have reflected on and thought, okay, well, the system mapping work was seen as quite challenging, but we can still explore some of the similar issues, and we can interrogate the policy area and any threats and opportunities just via using a slightly different approach.
Thanks, Beth. Okay, so another one at the top here also seems to be marine, but maybe both of you might have something to say about this. So Roger Sedon has asked, can you touch upon how you achieve blending of systems evaluation when you work with other jurisdictions? I'm thinking of marine projects, policies where you have to work with other states operating in the same marine environment.
Well, I can certainly start with that. So I work only on domestic marine. So I focus my work on that, but we do have an international marine division within our directorate. And like, for example, there is going to be an evaluation of the Blue Planet Fund, which is then crosses over different jurisdictions and includes countries that the UK might have governance roles over that aren't domestic. So there is certainly work going on, and I suppose from where I'm sitting within Defra and what I could bring in that situation is just to help to share that there are different systems approaches that could be used, and maybe to try and encourage some of my colleagues in that international space to consider them and chat openly about them with their policy sort of counterparts, because as as it's probably unsurprising, it would be a particularly complex area. I think most things in marine, and particularly thinking about international commitments and the role of the UK in those, they could be particularly helpful.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move to another question. So interesting to hear your thoughts on this. You did touch on it already a bit. So some anonymous person has said there seem to be missed opportunities to build shared understanding of a problem between stakeholder groups rather than just across policy teams. I'm surprised not to be hearing more about co-design in relation to this. What are the barriers to more co-design? Big question.
Shall I go first, and then Beth, you can come in as well, because I think we've both had experiences of this, and yeah, so it can be a really difficult area, really, and I think, you know, in an ideal situation, we would be looking to very much take that kind of co-design approach, bringing lots of different interest groups into the room. And I think that's kind of where we'd like to be. There's a kind of cultural barrier, though, I think, to some extent in doing this, and also, you know, as civil servants, we need to be careful that we are, you know, we need to represent the views of our ministers, and we also need to manage expectations and external communications very carefully as well. So I think one of the challenges we have doing systems thinking from within a central government department is that everything that Defra says gets written down and, you know, taken as well, this is new government policy or whatever, and we just need to be kind of careful about that. There's a certain amount of nervousness about that, even if it's managed quite carefully. So we've been we haven't completely kind of closed the doors and done everything in-house. We have run lots of workshops with farmers and other stakeholders in the land use space, for example, and those have been really useful and powerful, but they're tended to be easier to do when we can get a third party to run them for us in a way. So we work with an academic partner and do it as part something which is very, very clearly an academic or a sort of research exercise, as opposed to something which is so it's kind of becomes one step removed. So that kind of creates a bit of a safe space for us to work in that sense. But it'd be interesting to see actually whether things do change kind of over into the future with maybe a bit more openness towards kind of a more open policy making approach, whereby we have a sort of more deliberative way of working. Beth, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm just conscious that I've probably got about 30 seconds, but I'll try and be as brief as possible.
Yeah, sorry.
No, so good. So it's just thinking about, and I know there are challenges with this approach as well, but we do within marine and fisheries actually do quite a lot of consultations, and we do have to read and to take into consideration what they say. So there is stakeholder input coming in, but maybe not necessarily like straight into the workshops that we've spoken about today. But that does actually get considered by the evidence and policy teams, and it will be sort of shaping their thinking. One area at the moment where co-design is actually being actively sought is like within fisheries management plans, and so it is something there is real sort of especially within social research teams, but there is real encouragement to try and make sure that the policies are fit for purpose, and obviously that includes collaboration and engagement with the stakeholders. And again, within marine and fisheries, if we're not the best people to do that, then we will sort of look to academics. But in fisheries, for example, we do look into sort of local groups there, or different organisations which have more of a local presence to work with us to help ensure that.
Great, thanks both. So we've come to the end of the webinar now. There are quite a lot more questions which I'll I'll pass on to you both if you're happy to kind of answer by email. I don't know, or we can talk about that, or maybe people can get in touch with you. Your emails, I think, were on the slides. So thank you both for a really interesting presentation, and really great to hear what you're doing, and look forward to seeing how this progresses in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.